summer of 1948, the state of Idaho loaded 76 beavers into wooden crates, flew them out over a roadless stretch of wilderness in a twin-engine plane, and pushed them out the door. Every single crate had its own parachute. This actually happened. It's one of the strangest wildlife relocation programs ever attempted. And it is also, without really meaning to be, one of the most quietly effective pieces of civil engineering in American history. Because a beaver, left alone in the right stream, will build something that costs governments millions of dollars to replicate with concrete and steel. And it will do it for free, instinctively, without a single blueprint, a single engineering degree, or a single completed environmental review. Every other episode on this channel starts with a company, a government, or a construction crew deciding to build something enormous. This one starts with a rodent that has no idea it's an engineer at all. This is Titan Build. This is the story of the only engineer on this channel that has never once looked at a set of plans, and the disaster it may have accidentally prevented, 70 years after it fell out of an airplane. To understand why anyone thought parachuting rodents into the mountains was a reasonable plan, you have to understand the problem Idaho actually had. To understand why Idaho even had beavers to spare, you have to go back further still, to a slaughter that very nearly finished the species off on this continent entirely. For roughly 2 centuries, the fur trade across North America ran substantially on beaver pelts, prized in Europe for making waterproof felt hats. Trapping companies pushed deeper into unmapped territory chasing the animal, and by the middle of the 1800s, beavers had been wiped out across huge stretches of their former range. Entire river systems that had supported thriving colonies, for thousands of years left with none at all. It's a strange, quiet historical footnote that a European fashion trend 2 centuries earlier is a large part of why, by the time Idaho needed to move its beavers in 1948, so few corners of the American West still had a healthy population to draw from in the first place. By the 1940s, the state had a small but genuinely troublesome beaver population it badly wanted to move. Settlers arriving in the valleys were building homes, farms, and roads directly in beaver territory, and the animals kept doing what beavers do: damming the nearest stream, flooding the nearest field, and infuriating the nearest farmer. Wildlife officials needed to relocate hundreds of them into the empty, protected wilderness of the Chamberlain Basin, deep in central Idaho. There was only one real problem. There were no roads into the Chamberlain Basin. That was the entire point of it being protected wilderness. Hauling a beaver in by mule, in a metal crate, across dozens of kilometers of mountain trail in summer heat, killed a large number of the animals before they ever reached the water. The state needed a faster way in. A fish and game employee named Elmo Heter had an idea that sounded, on paper, completely ridiculous: build a crate that opens automatically on impact, attach it to a military surplus parachute, and drop the beavers out of a plane. Beavers, it turns out, tolerate the process surprisingly well. They're stocky, low, slung animals built to absorb a hard landing, and a wooden crate cushions the impact enough that a properly rigged parachute drop is, if anything, gentler on the animal than days strapped to the back of a mule on a mountain trail in July heat. Before he tried it on live animals, he tested it on one very patient beaver the team nicknamed Geronimo. Heter packed him into the prototype box and dropped him, again and again, from a plane circling a local airfield, refining the design each time until the climp ended cleanly and the beaver climbed out unharmed. Geronimo, by all accounts, handled the repeated skydiving with more composure than most of the humans involved.
Blueprints.
Heter later wrote up the entire project in a formal report for a wildlife management journal, under a title so straightforwardly bizarre it barely needs a punchline: Transplanting Beavers by Airplane and Parachute. Decades later, it's still cited by wildlife biologists, not as a joke, but as a genuinely useful account of how to move large, water-dependent animals into roadless terrain, without losing most of them on the way in. On the 14th of August, 1948, the real operation began. Crate after crate went out the door of a Beechcraft over the Chamberlain Basin. Parachutes blooming open above a landscape no road had ever reached. Geronimo himself got the honor of the very first drop. Released with 3 female beavers into a valley the crew had already decided to call, only half jokingly, a beaver paradise. Each crate was built to split open on landing, hinged so the impact itself would spring the latch, and let the animal simply climb out into unfamiliar territory within seconds, rather than being trapped inside a box in the wilderness waiting for a rescue team on foot. Ground crews then hiked in separately over the following days to confirm survival, tracking down as many of the released animals as they could find, checking on newly built lodges, watching for the first signs that the animals had actually settled rather than simply wandered off. By the time the program wrapped up, 76 beavers had been dropped from the sky into the Idaho wilderness. 75 of them survived the landing. For decades afterward, the story mostly lived on as a strange, charming footnote. The kind of thing that shows up in trivia questions, not policy documents. Nobody was tracking the ecological engineering those animals, and their descendants, kept quietly doing in that valley for the next 70 years. Then, in 2018, a wildfire tore through beaver country in Idaho. It burned through dry brush, through pine forest, through everything that could catch. Except, when the smoke cleared and satellite images came back, there were unmistakable green streaks, cutting through the blackened landscape. Strips of unburned, still hydrated vegetation, running along exactly the streams the beavers had spent generations flooding, damming, and re-flooding. The ground the beavers had kept wet had simply refused to burn the way everything around it did. That single, striking before and after image is what finally got scientists paying close attention to something beavers had apparently been doing this whole time, at scale, for free. It wasn't an isolated fluke either. As wildfires have grown larger and more frequent across the American West through the 2010s and 2020s, researchers deliberately started looking for the same pattern elsewhere, comparing burn scars against known beaver territory, on stream after stream, in state after state. The same green ribbons kept showing up, running through the middle of blackened hillsides, wherever a healthy beaver complex had been sitting on the water table beforehand. Here is the part that actually explains it, because a beaver is not fighting fire on purpose. It's just building a home. A beaver dam does one very simple thing extremely well. It slows water down. Instead of a stream cutting a single fast, narrow channel straight through a valley, a series of beaver dams spreads that same water sideways, across a much wider area, into dozens of shallower side channels, ponds, and saturated wet meadow. Water that used to rush through in hours now takes weeks, sometimes months, to make the same journey, soaking deep into the surrounding soil the entire way. That single change in behavior does 3 things human engineers spend enormous budgets trying to achieve separately. It raises the local water table, so plants nearby have access to moisture, even deep into a dry summer. It creates a wide, waterlogged buffer that simply will not carry a fast, moving fire the way dry grass will. And it holds water in the landscape during wet periods that would otherwise be lost downstream in days, releasing it slowly back out during the dry months that follow. There's a fourth effect, less dramatic, but just as valuable to anyone downstream. Slow water drops the sediment it's carrying instead of scoring it further along, which means a beaver pond acts as a kind of unpaid water treatment plant, filtering out silt, trapping excess nutrients from farm runoff, and locking carbon into the wet, oxygen-poor mud building up behind every dam. A single beaver pond does this quietly, year after year, without a single grant application. Researchers modeling this effect in California's Sierra Nevada estimate that beaver dams across the region have the potential to store more than 120 million cubic meters of surface water, and to create something like 2,000 to 100 square kilometers of meanly improved fire resilience, simply by existing. Ecologists have a term for a species whose presence reshapes the entire ecosystem around it far beyond its own numbers, a keystone species. The idea is usually illustrated with predators. Wolves reintroduced into Yellowstone, changing elk grazing patterns enough to let willow and aspen recover along entire river corridors, which in turn changed erosion patterns, which in turn changed where songbirds and beavers themselves could live. A beaver is a keystone species too, but through construction rather than predation. It doesn't change the ecosystem by eating something. It changes the ecosystem by physically rebuilding the plumbing underneath it. 120 million cubic meters is a genuinely large reservoir. Except nobody poured a single meter of concrete to build it. Nobody had to run an environmental impact study, secure a construction permit, or float a municipal bond. A rodent the size of a medium dog did it with its teeth and its tail. One branch at a time, because that is simply what the species does whenever it finds a slow-moving stream. None of this is only about the American West, either. As droughts have grown longer and more severe across large parts of the world, water managers everywhere have been forced to confront the same uncomfortable arithmetic. The old approach of moving water fast, off the land and into a reservoir behind a dam, works well for generating hydropower and filling a drinking water supply, but it is close to the worst possible strategy for keeping a landscape itself resilient during a dry year. A beaver system does the opposite. It deliberately keeps water slow, spread out, and soaked into the ground exactly where the plants, the soil, and the local wildlife actually need it. A beaver isn't building a dam because it understands drought cycles or fire ecology. It's building a dam because deep, still water is the one thing that keeps it safe from the predators that can't swim as well as it can. The animal is engineering a moat purely for its own survival. Every drought-proofed meadow, every fire-resistant wetland, every recharged aquifer downstream is just an accident. The unpaid, unintended side effect of one species trying not to get eaten. Once agencies actually started paying attention to what beavers were worth as unpaid infrastructure, some of them tried the obvious next move: build something that behaves like a beaver dam, in places beavers haven't gotten to yet. They're called beaver dam analogs. Rough, low, permeable structures made from wooden fence posts, driven into a stream bed and woven through with willow branches, built to slow water down the exact same way a real dam does, just without waiting for an actual beaver to show up and do it. One restoration program in British Columbia, aiming to reduce wildfire, drought, and flood risk across the province, has already built more than 70 of these structures, across half a dozen sites. A fraction of the cost of engineered flood infrastructure, assembled in days rather than years. It is, in a strange way, the highest compliment an engineer can pay an animal copying its homework by hand. Because the original design still works better than anything a design team came up with from scratch. Compare that to what a conventional, human-engineered wetland restoration project usually costs. Permits, hydrological surveys, heavy machinery, contracted labor, and ongoing maintenance can push a single serious restoration site into the hundreds of thousands of dollars, sometimes more, before a single liter of extra water is actually being held on the landscape. A beaver dam analog, built from posts and branches, by a small volunteer crew in an afternoon, can start doing comparable work within a single wet season, for a rounding error of that cost. Genuine full-scale ecosystem engineering, priced like a fence. One of the clearest tests of what a real beaver dam is worth happened on a stretch of water called Bridge Creek in central Oregon, where researchers were trying to answer a very specific question. Could beaver activity actually help an endangered fish? Steelhead trout and salmon in the creek were struggling, in part because decades of straightened, over-grazed stream channel had left the water running fast, shallow, and short on the slow side. Pools young fish need to hide and feed in before they're strong enough for the open river. Researchers installed a small number of beaver dam analogs to jump, start the process, then stepped back and let actual beavers move in and take over. Over the next 7 years, the number of active, intact dams on that stretch of creek climbed from 24 to 142. The stream widened. The floodplain came back. Side channels and slow pools reappeared exactly where the fish needed them, and survival rates for young salmon and steelhead measurably improved. Nobody built any of those 142 dams by hand. The beavers did, once the water was slow enough for the first ones to feel safe moving in. That's the part conventional stream restoration usually can't replicate, no matter how much money gets thrown at it. Engineers can dig a wider channel with excavators in a single season. What they can't easily manufacture is a self-repairing structure that notices a leak the morning after a storm and has it patched by nightfall. A beaver dam that blows out in a flood gets rebuilt within days, often stronger, using material gathered from right beside the breach. A concrete or steel structure that fails needs a contractor, a budget line, and a permit before anyone even starts fixing it. None of this makes the beaver some kind of flawless, harmless miracle worker, and it would be dishonest to end the story there. A beaver moving into a new stream doesn't check a zoning map first. New dams can flood a farmer's field, back water up over a rural road, or drown a stretch of forest a landowner had other plans for. In drier regions, a new dam can also temporarily hold back water that downstream users and downstream ecosystems were counting on receiving on the usual schedule. In large parts of the world, beavers are still legally treated as a nuisance species first and an ecosystem engineer second. Trapped, relocated, or simply removed the moment their dam becomes inconvenient to the nearest human structure. The same qualities that make a beaver a brilliant, unpaid hydrologist make it a genuinely difficult neighbor for anyone who didn't ask for a wetland on their property. Wildlife agencies have spent decades caught in the middle, fielding complaints from landowners with one hand, while trying to convince the same landowners, with the other, that the flooded field costing them a season of hay might be quietly saving their whole watershed from the next drought. For most of the 20th century, the standard answer to a beaver in the wrong place was simple: trap it, and either relocate it somewhere with fewer complaints, or kill it outright. It was fast, it was cheap in the short term, and in places with strong agricultural or property rights lobbies, it's still the default response today. The problem is that removing the beaver doesn't remove the reason a beaver wanted that spot in the first place. Left empty, the same stretch of slow water tends to attract another one within a season or two, and the cycle resets. The practical answer that's emerged in places willing to try something other than trap and remove isn't fighting the beaver at all. It's outsmarting the water level it insists on. In the 1990s, a wildlife biologist named Skip Lissel designed a simple pipe and cage system, nicknamed a beaver deceiver, that runs straight through the middle of a dam or a flooded culvert. The device lets water keep flowing at a level the beaver can't detect, sense, or block. Because the sound and feel of running water is exactly what triggers a beaver to start piling on more sticks in the first place. Trick the animal into thinking the leak is already sealed, and it stops building. The road stays open. The pond stays exactly where the beaver wants it. Nobody has to trap or relocate anything. Europe learned this the hard way from the opposite direction, and the numbers there are even starker than what happened in North America. The continent's own native beaver, a close cousin of the American species, was hunted for its fur, its meat, and a musky secretion once used in perfume and medicine. Across virtually its entire natural range, for centuries, it vanished from England and Wales by the 12th or 13th century. It vanished from Scotland not long after, 1200, by the year 1900. That's roughly how many European beavers were left alive on the entire continent, scattered across just 8 isolated refuge populations stretching from France to Mongolia. Not 1,200 per country. 1,200 total everywhere for a species that had once occupied river systems from the Atlantic coast to Siberia. It has taken the better part of a century of careful, sometimes controversial reintroduction programs, country by country, river system by river system, to claw the species back from that number. Beginning in the 1920s, and continuing in waves ever since, wildlife agencies have carried out at least 157 separate reintroduction efforts across 24 European countries. Scotland formally recognized beavers as a protected native species again only in 2016. Reintroduction projects along river deltas in Germany, the Netherlands, and Poland have spent decades slowly rebuilding populations that were once wiped off the map entirely, river basin by river basin, one relocated family at a time. By 2021, that 1,200 had become an estimated 1.5 million beavers, back across the continent that had all but erased them. The animal that European settlers spent 3 centuries trying to eliminate is now the same animal wildlife agencies on both sides of the Atlantic are quietly trying to put back. Step back, and the whole story is a genuinely strange one to tell on a channel about impossible things humans build. Here, the impossible thing wasn't built by a human at all. It was built by an animal doing exactly what its instincts have told it to do for millions of years, in a landscape it was forcibly removed from, first by trappers chasing a fashion trend, then on a different continent entirely, by hunters chasing a scent gland, and then, decades later, dropped back into that landscape by parachute, or driven back into it in the back of a truck, one relocated family at a time, by the same species that had spent centuries trying to erase it. There's a term ecologists have started using for this whole family of approaches, from the straw grids in a Chinese desert to the willow and post analogs in an Oregon Creek tea process-based restoration. The idea, stated plainly, is that instead of engineering the finished result you want to see, you re-establish the natural process that used to build and maintain that result on its own, and then you get out of the way and let it keep running. It's a quieter, less photogenic philosophy than pouring a dam or planting a forest in straight rows, and it rarely produces a single dramatic ribbon-cutting moment for a camera crew to film. What it produces instead is something a poured structure almost never can. A system that keeps repairing itself, for free, long after the last engineer has gone home. Every technique in this story, in the end, is really the same technique wearing a different coat. A straw grid slows wind enough for a root to grab hold. A willow and post analog slows water enough for a real dam to feel safe going up beside it. A parachute drop moves an animal past a stretch of land with no road through it. A pipe hidden inside a dam tricks that same animal into building somewhere less inconvenient. None of it forces the landscape to do anything. All of it just clears a small, patient path back to something that already knew how to fix itself, if anyone would simply stop standing in the way. Somewhere out there right now, on a stream nobody's mapped the beaver activity, on yet a family that descends, however many generations removed, from Geronimo and the 74 other animals who survived that August afternoon is very likely still out there, still gnawing, still stacking branches, still doing the only job it has ever known how to do. It has no idea it's an engineer. It has no idea it's a wildfire strategy, a drought buffer, or a fish nursery. It just knows the water sounds wrong until the leak stops, and it isn't going to bed until that's fixed. 75 animals, falling out of an airplane over a valley with no name anyone remembers, in 1948, with no idea what they were about to become. And 70 years later, when a wildfire came through looking for something to burn, the one thing that refused to catch was the ground those same animals, and the generations that followed them, had quietly, patiently, stubbornly kept wet the entire time. Nobody planned that outcome in 1948. Elmo Heter wasn't thinking about wildfire resilience or watershed carbon storage when he packed Geronimo into a wooden box and pushed him out of a Beechcraft. He was thinking about a much smaller, Much more immediate problem: too many angry farmers, too many flooded fields, and no road into the one valley empty enough to send the beavers where they'd stop causing trouble for people. Solving that one narrow, practical headache is what, 7 decades later, left a green scar cutting clean through a wildfire nobody in 1948 could have possibly predicted. That's usually how the biggest wins in this story work. Nobody sets out to build climate resilience. Somebody just tries to solve the problem directly in front of them, using the cheapest, simplest tool available, and the rest compounds quietly in the background for decades, until somebody with a satellite photo finally notices. More of this, real engineering, real stakes, animal or human, every week on Titan Build. Subscribe if that's your thing. One question before you go. If the best flood and fire infrastructure humans have found so far is just letting a rodent do what it's always done, how much of what we call engineering is really just people relearning something nature already finished designing?